G'day, Ian.
Hi, how you going?
Good. How are you?
Good, thanks.
Welcome to the podcast, and I'm going to jump straight into it.
Go for it.
You make some pretty wild work, don't you?
Thanks. Yeah, I do try.
So give us a bit of a rundown of what you're doing with this body of work you've been.
Well, I've been working as an artist for over 30 years, really, in all sorts of media, predominantly video. I seem to gravitate towards that more so than anything else, but I'm also interested in kind of installation, sculpture, drawing. You know, I've done virtual reality works, augmented reality. I'm doing some AI stuff at the moment. But I'm kind of interested in and I guess this idea of like an anti-discipline art practice, you know. I'm more interested in the ideas that are kind of underpinning the works. A lot of the ideas being around the body and the confrontation of the body, body horror, these kinds of things, and our relationship to the, I guess, contemporary media environment, and how that kind of amplifies this kind of body awareness in a sense, you know. The stuff I've been doing recently with AI, and I've got quite a lot of stuff to say about AI, I guess, is the, you know, I'm posting a lot of stuff on Instagram and like these kind of mutant, kind of, you know, deformed humans and stuff. And I thought that was kind of perverse because Instagram is well known for its kind of, you know, as a platform for kind of idealized kind of selfies, like idealized kind of human bodies, you know. So my kind of AI kind of mutations are anything but idealized, you know.
Yeah, they're pretty wild. Got this kind of beautiful, grotesque quality to them.
Well, there's something repellent about them, but like there is in a lot of my work, I guess, you know. Initially, I was drawn to AI, you know, mainly because of the, you know, programs like Midjourney. There were these kind of certain key words you weren't allowed to use. And a lot of the words you weren't allowed to use were kind of bodily related, like things like bodily fluids or corpse, flesh. You know, I don't think you can even use the word Cronenberg after David Cronenberg, you know. So I was kind of interested that here's this kind of, you know, emerging new technological platform, but it's kind of filtering out representations of the human body. So I found that to be really interesting. So part of the motivation for doing that work is to try and, I guess, circumnavigate the various kinds of filters that are in place to kind of produce kind of work that is more, you know, in line with my particular body-focused sensibility, I guess.
So how did you circumvent those filters?
It's just, you just find certain kinds of prompts that work, you know, and, you know, there's one thing about AI which I find really interesting, and I know there's a lot of debates around it and stuff, but, you know, having worked in kind of digital media and technology-driven art practice and video art for years, there's something I miss in regards to the idea of like failure or mistakes. You know, unlike in other kinds of art practices, like, you know, more traditional things like painting, often a mistake can be a really beneficial thing. You know, you can turn that into something. But in digital media, you've always got the undo option, you know, so you never really fully embrace mistakes. But AI is making itself available for that kind of space in my practice of like errors and malfunctions and distortions, particularly in relationship to the human body. I've also circumnavigated it by using different kinds of software as well, you know, different kinds of AI platforms and stuff. I mean, there's lots to talk about with AI, you know, it's, and I think there's a bit of I get the kind of arguments about it and the concern that it's kind of, you know, we're using kind of other artists' work, you know, without their kind of consent. I get that, but there's also a bit of a weird disconnect, I think, that people have, particularly in the art community. Because what's the difference with going to like a museum with your smartphone and you're taking a high resolution digital image of a painting that you then have? You haven't got the consent of that artist to do that. And in actual fact, it's higher resolution than anything AI is doing, you know. The other disconnect I find is that artists kind of misunderstand, I think, how machine learning works. My understanding of it is that it's not like sampling. I'm not sampling an artist's work like it's a perfect digital copy. It's like a synthesis. Like machine learning is kind of learning, you know, what I like, what I dislike, you know. So it's not strictly stealing images in the same way that, for example, I think sampling could be argued. There's also another weird disconnect, I think, that artists often have no problems, you know, putting their work on a platform like Meta or Facebook or whatever, and, you know, signing away the licensing of that image to a multinational corporation. That's perfectly fine, it seems, you know, but AI has become like the scapegoat for all the evils in the world to do with like digital media. So like I said, I've got lots to say about these kind of debates.
What do you think drives that, I guess, paranoia?
It's interesting. I've thought about this a lot, you know, and I think with all new kind of technologies, once they're introduced into culture, that there's like a bit of alarmism and hysteria around them. I mean, I was reading about the history of film, history of cinema. When that was emerging, like audiences thought they were going to go blind because the films were traveling at 24 frames a second, you know. So there's always this fear until it settles down, I think, and until they're kind of enmeshed in these kind of cultural narratives and the hysteria kind of, you know, evens out a bit. So we're in that kind of weird moment, you know. I also think there's lots of like issues that come up with AI that are kind of like decades old, you know, arguments around, you know, originality and authenticity and these kinds of things, which I was dealing with those concerns like 30 years ago, you know, and they go back way before that. So it's suddenly now with the arrival of this technology, you've got a whole generation of artists suddenly dealing with these issues of authenticity and originality, which are way, way, way older arguments, you know.
What are some of those arguments? What's like the common thread that goes through AI and maybe issues that you've had decades ago?
Sure. Well, I guess I can understand the idea that, I mean, even doing AI work, I don't even really feel that they're my images, which I'm perfectly fine with. You know, I'm just like a conduit between the kind of AI software and my own brain, you know. And so, you know, I have no problem also if my images were taken and used in data sets. I mean, it may seem weird, but I'm not particularly kind of precious about my work in that way, you know. I'm okay for it to be used and kind of reconfigured and transformed. And I think AI too, it seems to tap into that idea that we all do as artists. Like we're all kind of sponges. We're all picking up ideas all the time and processing them and both consciously and unconsciously. Like I'm stealing ideas from all sorts of places, you know. And AI is really just doing that in a more kind of amplified way, you know. And I know there are issues with AI and there's kind of concerns there about it kind of, you know, particularly being controlled by these kind of multinational corporations. So it's kind of AI according to kind of Google or something, which I think is disturbing, like the world according to some multinational corporation, you know.
I mean, you said you feel like they're not your images, you're just a conduit. I mean, I would argue that every artist is just a conduit between an idea and the reality of that idea.
Yeah.
I mean, you buy paint
Yeah.
That paint comes from a multinational.
Exactly. Yeah.
Like you buy a camera to take a photo, it comes from a multinational.
Yeah.
I think,
yeah,
mate, it's a bit harsh to single out maybe
True.
AI
Yeah.
and stuff like that as being something different in that way. It's kind of the same.
Well, it is. It's a tool, and it's basically, it's just arrived on the cultural radar at the moment, and it's this kind of moral panic surrounding it. And I kind of get that to an extent. But it's also, as an artist, I'm driving it. So it's my particular sensibility that's driving it. And, a lot of what appears as AI also is fairly generic. And there's a lot of really bad examples of AI. It's kind of like, versions of like deviant art or something, very cliched, very kind of trope-based kind of imagery. So my own work is kind of pushing back against that kind of generic kind of sameness of a lot of that stuff as well.
What I like about looking at, because this is the only work I've seen of yours, is this AI stuff. And they kind of look like happy snaps.
Yeah.
Was that a conscious choice to make them look? Because you look at it at a glance, and it's just a happy snap or something, and then you see this distortion and weird things that don't make sense, and that's what draws me into it.
Well, perhaps that's also the platform that they're on. Instagram provides that reading a bit because Instagram is known for like its kind of happy snaps of selfies or incidental shots. So there's various themes there of AI that I've done, but the dominating one seems to be kind of backyard barbecues with organs on the outside of people's bodies. That seems to be the dominant kind of, theme.
Now, I want to actually, AI is a recent thing.
Sure.
So what's the bridge between this work and your older work?
But when AI first appeared, I mean, a year ago I started using it. I kind of thought, right, holy shit, this kind of technology is a perfect kind of synthesis of like my concerns as an artist and my interest in kind of, deformations of the flesh and synthesized through kind of technology. It arrived just at the right time. But I've always been interested in this idea of kind of the base level body, and David Cronenberg, the filmmaker, who's been an ongoing, influence for me for over 40 years, he had a quip that, the body is ground zero. Without the body, there's no culture, there's no sex, there's no politics, there's nothing. So I like to return to that idea of the body constantly, but particularly the body in relationship to kind of technology and our technological kind of environment. I guess some of my stuff plays into this kind of high art, low art divide, but I'm kind of suspicious of that a little bit, even though I teach a course in the art school at RMIT called Pop and Trash, which attempts to dismantle some of this hierarchy of high and low culture. I'm suspicious of those terms because I see them just as constructions, and they're used predominantly by people that are outside of those cultures. If you're kind of consuming low culture, like a horror film or something, you don't refer to it as low culture, So yeah, I'm kind of playing with some of this kind of language and some of these kinds of belief systems, I guess.
Yeah. So from you've been making art for, what was it?
30 odd years.
30 odd years.
Probably longer, in fact. Yeah.
I mean, what were you doing all that time? Where did you start? Was it always the body, even back then?
Kind of, yeah. It's always been a focus, I mean, I did a course years ago called Media Arts, which was like a hybrid kind of art course, which I ended up teaching in. It was interesting because it wasn't really a film school and it wasn't really an art school. It was somewhat mutant media, and it was somewhere in between, and they had a really big influence on me. And so at the time, we're going back 40 years now, I was learning about, experimental film, which had a big impact on me, experimental video practice. contemporary art, all this kind of stuff. But I was also getting another education in the early 80s, which was through video libraries. I used to live and breathe video libraries in the early 80s, as a lot of people did, you know. I worked in a video library for a time. I used to live above a video library. So there was a lot of kind of, you know, content around video. And particularly, it was quite noticeable back then that a lot of horror titles, you know, appeared on video and exploitation cinema and stuff like that. So I was getting two educations there. One was like at art school, learning about experimental film and art, and the other one was like exploitation film and kind of horror. And that was from a very early age, you know, like in my, like, you know, late teens, early 20s. And I knew about people like, you know, David Cronenberg and John Carpenter and this kind of stuff. And, you know, then going to art school and meeting people like Phil Brophy, who taught out there, and, you know, he was writing a lot on, you know, on body horror at the time, one of the only critical voices in Australia really talking about this stuff. So that had a bit of an impact on me. But even with Cronenberg, you know, and the influence that he's had on me over the years, I've always considered Cronenberg a conceptual filmmaker. You know, I never really thought of him, well, sure, he's a horror filmmaker, but there's clearly a lot of kind of concepts kind of going on there in his kind of filmmaking practice. So this idea that you could talk about horror in a conceptual way rather than purely as a kind of, you know, visceral kind of entertainment, that had a big impact on me, that kind of stuff.
You've mentioned Cronenberg. That's how... Cronenberg? Is that...
Cronenberg, yeah.
Cronenberg. Not too familiar. What films has he...
we're talking The Fly, you know, Naked Lunch, you know, Crimes of the Future, Scanners, The Brood, you know, all of these kind of, that whole period of like body horror from really, you know, the late 60s to kind of now. Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, were you into those like, what was that production company that made like B class, B grade, Troma?
Less
Toxic Avenger,
less
stuff
so,
like
because I thought they were kind of interesting, but I'm not a huge fan of like horror comedy. You know, it seems like the antithesis. You know, like if it's funny, it's not going to be scary. You know, you either choose your camp, one or the other. You know, and sometimes it can work, but yeah, I'm more into kind of horror as horror. You know,
so you like the blood, guts, and gore sort of thing?
Well, I'm drawn to that because I think it represents this kind of, you know, confrontation of the body. And, you know, it's kind of like something Stephen King said years ago, horror prepares us for our own deaths, you know. So there's something about horror and about the kind of leaking body and the integrity of the body kind of breaking down, the whole kind of, which plays a lot into my work, this idea of this schizophrenic relationship we have with the body, which is something Cronenberg said years ago, I think, you know. And this is a good example of like, you know, the AI stuff. I can't remember, you know, stuff that I've read that Cronenberg said or something that I've actually thought, you know. It's all confused in my brain, just like AI kind of is. But Cronenberg came up with this kind of idea that we have this schizophrenic relationship with the body. Like on one hand, we're kind of in awe of this kind of exterior idealized body, you know, but we're repulsed by the same interior of the same body, you know. I thought that was really interesting, that kind of duality, you know, which plays out in a lot of horror films, and something my own work has tried to kind of delve into.
Why do you think people are repulsed by the interior? I mean, I would.
Well,
say
yeah.
that
I mean, it's kind of
we're
like,
not meant to see it.
We're not meant to see it. It's meant to be off limits. We don't. I mean, we don't regularly see the interior of our own bodies. You know, we're kind of a little bit in denial of that. You know, we take a shit, we quickly kind of flush it away. You know, so this kind of removal of the interior of the body. I think there's something about the body that's always fascinated me, is that it's irrational. It's unconscious. And when you pair that with kind of contemporary technology, which is something I'm really interested in, technology is all about the rational. It's all about the logical, the binary. So you've kind of got these two things fighting against one another. And that's where my practice kind of sits, within that kind of tension between the rational and the irrational body. You know, that's the intention anyway.
And that kind of being repulsed by the inside, is that, what do you think makes kind of horror films and horror images, makes people consider it as kind of lowbrow art in an arts kind of sense?
Well, yeah, which is kind of weird though, because that's the construction in a way. And I think we're repulsed by some of that stuff because I think ultimately we're all in denial of death, you know, so we don't want to kind of deal with that stuff. You know, we kind of like, we don't want to talk about that stuff in polite conversation, you know. But horror gives a voice to that. It gives a voice to that kind of latent kind of fear that we all kind of have, you know. The lowbrow stuff is interesting, I think, when it comes to horror, because if you don't watch horror films, people probably think, yeah, it's all just lowbrow, kind of puerile, kind of shock value stuff. But if you're watching this stuff regularly, you kind of know there's a much more nuanced kind of genre there, you know. So it's kind of interesting in the context of the art world, when you're dealing with like body horror themes, it's not always completely compatible with the art world, because there's a lot of kind of snobbish kind of attitudes there. And they probably view that stuff as kind of, oh, that's too low brow for me, you know. Even though we've gone through this whole period of like, you know, a flattened culture where there is no low and high, I still think we perceive in the art world this kind of hierarchy which still exists, which I'm always, you know, battling against, I guess.
Yeah, and like almost anything, if you look at it deeply enough, it's nuanced.
Yeah, exactly.
It all is, and
exactly.
And like with horror specifically, it's almost like, I don't like this art, therefore it's lowbrow.
Yeah.
I think is a bit of it's a bit closed-minded to look at it like that.
Yeah. It's I don't fully understand it, so therefore I'll dismiss it.
Yeah.
You know, no, absolutely. And I see that all the time. And, you know, it's kind of, you know, I sometimes catch myself thinking, oh, gee, maybe I should stop doing this body horror stuff. And maybe I should stop making work about flesh and meats and stuff and actually do something else, you know. But then I find myself returning to these themes more and more again, you know. So there's something quite obsessive about that in regards to my own practice.
I mean, it's what you want to do. You should do what you want to do.
Exactly, yeah. Exactly. I think all artists should follow their obsessions. I really do.
And you've made some films yourself? Horror films?
Well, kind of horror films. They're a bit indescribable in a way. I've just finished a project, actually, which I'm really pleased with. It's got the catchy title of worm pornography. There's no porn in it. It's more about, you know, thinking about pornography from another species, you know. And it's kind of riffing off some of the stuff during kind of lockdown and kind of COVID, you know. It's like this whole thing about contagion and how a lot of the COVID stuff was all mediated through, you know, television and the internet and the virus and, you know, all this kind of stuff. So it's a little bit like a kind of a COVID kind of fever dream or something, you know. But it's not strictly a film. It's caught somewhere between, I guess, quite in a hybrid way, which I like, a short film and a video artwork, you know. So conventional narrative film people would probably hate it, you know. But that's okay. I'm not really interested in appealing to that kind of crowd so much. It's more of a kind of sensorium kind of thing where you're trapped in some kind of, you know, worm simulation or worm machine for like half an hour. So I'm just in the process of trying to find places to show it.
Oh, I've got to see this. So it's not on online or anything.
Not at the
like
moment,
that.
no.
Oh,
I'll send you a copy.
Yes, I'd love one. It happens every podcast. I kind of lose myself a little bit now because I'm thinking about that film.
You're thinking about worms.
Yeah.
But yeah, I've made other kinds of, attempts at like, longer form films and stuff that have a bit more of a kind of conventional kind of structure. I did a piece a few years ago called The Foaming Node, which was a kind of feature-length thing about a cult or these cult members that had escaped the clutches of the cult, and they were kind of retelling their story within a kind of, generic breakfast TV kind of, setting. But I do have aspirations to make a real feature film at one point. But then again, I kind of think maybe that's not really me. As much as I consume a lot of that stuff, I don't really kind of honestly think I can kind of make a real film. It's always going to be fucked up in some way, and it's always going to be mutant and hybrid, and probably not enough plot to kind of to be described as a conventional film.
And these films you've already made, I'm guessing they're the kind of thing where you've written, directed, shot.
Yeah, I do a lot of it myself. Even though, filmmaking and video making is a collaborative process, I often do work with a sound person, or I may work with someone else to do something, But generally, they're kind of a solo kind of project. I mean, I've made all sorts of videos over the years, and so that's the other thing with my practice is that I show my work all over the place. Like sometimes it's in galleries, sometimes it's in film festivals, sometimes it's on the internet, sometimes it's in some biennale, it's all over the shop. I don't place any particular value on one or the other. Like this idea that the gallery occupies some kind of preeminent status, I'm really suspicious of that. Like I'll show my stuff anywhere. I'm not so kind of focused on that kind of mindset that it needs to only exist purely in a gallery environment. I think there's so many other opportunities these days for artists.
Yeah, I mean, for a film, all you need is a screen and somewhere for people to look at it. I was just thinking, I asked about, your previous films because I'd imagine if you're going to do like a full feature film, you relinquish some of the control that you might have over it. And if you're used to making things on your own.
Sure.
I don't know, would you find that a difficult jump?
Possibly. I have done stuff like that in the past where I've worked with cinematographers and people recording the sound and lighting and stuff like that. So I have had some familiar, experience with that. But I guess it's sometimes, it goes against this kind of obsessive kind of way of working, how I work, where I'm just kind of, creating layers and layers and layers and compositing things and combining live action with AI and other kinds of, combinations of like visual images. So that's often how I work in the studio. But in some ways, I'm a bit sick of that as well because it's quite kind of isolating working in that way. But I'm also really impatient, so the idea of having to develop a script to then possibly get some kind of funding to produce this kind of movie is something I'm possibly a bit too impatient to kind of do.
Yeah, it's I don't know. I look at it and go, no, I couldn't do it. It looks like a huge undertaking.
Yeah,
making something like a film.
Yeah,
and having to work with a whole bunch of people that might not, or probably won't share your vision completely.
Yeah,
and having to deal with that, it'd be too much.
Yeah,
too much for me. So
so no doubt I'll probably because I'm always working on stuff. I'm just one of those kinds of artists. I've got lots of things happening all the time. So no doubt I will make another film project, but I probably will end up kind of just making some other obsessive kind of mutant project that'll take a couple of years, whatever, to generate. But that's just how it goes, I mean, there's also the opportunity, I think, I want to show this particular work is also like an installation component in a gallery as well. So it can occupy both of those kinds of zones of like a cinema and also like a standalone kind of installation. That kind of hybridity, interests me a lot.
You meant at the start of the podcast, you came up with you said anti-discipline.
Oh,
now,
yeah.
When I heard anti-discipline, I think, you know what, I'll have a cup of coffee, then I'll start. I'm sure that's not what you meant.
So no.
Explain anti-discipline to us.
Anti-discipline, I mean, I guess, the term means I'm not beholden to any particular discipline in the sense that I'm not a purist in that way. Sure, I work with video, but I'll also work with AI, or I'll do a drawing, or I'll make an installation or a sculptural work. It's all just material. It's all equal to me. I don't place any kind of value judgment on this stuff. It's more about the ideas and where the ideas are taking the idea, basically. And in some cases that may be a video work. In some cases it may be more of an installation thing. It really kind of depends. I'm finding at the moment the video stuff is, is probably a particular focus that I'm kind of interested in at the moment because, like all artists, I get a bit disillusioned with the art world. The whole preciousness of it, I find a little kind of irritating sometimes. I think the world of film doesn't have that to quite the same degree, so that interests me.
So the film world and the art world are two separate things, you think?
I'm thinking purely in the sense of like there's a film festival world and then you've got the art gallery world, and sometimes they connect with one another, absolutely, and that's great, but other times they are quite removed, I think, and it's kind of, my own practice sits somewhere in the middle there, and it's, I've always shown my work in film festivals and video festivals, for forever. It seems very natural for me to do that, and some of my work just simply doesn't translate through to like the gallery world, Plus for a long time there in the 90s, I was doing a lot of stuff with like technology and I was probably pigeonholed as like a new media artist. And there's a bit of a stigma about that, I think, at the time. It's like a new media artist. They're kind of like, this evangelism around the digital future and this kind of thing. And I get that. But really, at the time, I was more kind of like interested in the hype cycle of digital technology and this idea of like, it was the end of the millennium and this kind of these digital tools were going to take us into the future. And there was all this kind of, utopian rhetoric around digital kind of media in the 90s in particular. And I found that kind of interesting. And I made a number of projects kind of around that and in relationship to kind of the body and the digital body and the augmentation of the body. I did all sorts of stuff like that in the 90s. But even back then, I remember a lot of galleries were somewhat allergic to kind of technology back then. Because technology was something that was on your computer, you didn't see it in a gallery necessarily. But that's shifting now, and the art world is kind of opening up more to this stuff. Even though they're particularly alarmist though around things like AI, so it's kind of like, oh yeah, we're back in that period again.
It's the same thing all over again.
Yeah, the kind of hysteria,
How true the rhetoric surrounding digital art in the 90s, how true did that rhetoric end up being?
Sure, yeah, exactly. We're kind of living through some of that stuff now. And this is where the AI stuff, I think, just to remove the conversation from the art world for a moment, like, the very real fear of AI, I think, is not so much I think the debate should shift from this whole idea of the bias of AI or using people's images without their consent. Sure, I get that. That's an argument. But I think the real discussion should be around how AI is insidiously being integrated into our everyday life, and via the network and via things now, like there are like these new prototypes of like, central bank digital currency, which is the pet hate of mine. This idea of like AI controlled currency, programmable currency, like these are very real things. They're not conspiracy theories, and the idea of a central bank and the government being able to control the currency, I think is unbelievably disturbing. And it's kind of a slippery slope, I think, into things like the Chinese social credit system. And AI is kind of facilitating this, and it's all going to be sold to the general public under the guise of like convenience, So even my own AI work that I'm doing is kind of pushing back against that. And it's kind of showing this kind of horror of what AI is kind of doing,
Yeah, and those other things are far scarier than someone creating a landscape on Midjourney.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's
like
a non-issue.
These are real concerns, And people seem somewhat like apathetic about that. It's kind of really strange to me. I've had conversations with people about the CBDC stuff, the central bank digital currency, and they just look at me like I'm some kind of freak. These are real prototypes that are being rolled out now, and will be here within the next 18 months, if not sooner.
Yeah, and it's just things we know. I wonder what we don't know.
Exactly. Yeah.
The issue I would have possibly with AI art and maybe even digital art, but not so much now when you really think about it, but especially AI art, is people looking at it and not seeing. It's not so much it's sampled images or anything like that. It's the perceived labor of the artist is missing in a way, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Digital art, now that most people understand what goes into making something like that, that you see the labor.
Yeah.
But I'd imagine AI art, people don't see the labor.
Yeah. So labor equals value. Yeah.
Yeah.
Or equals aesthetic value. Yeah. I get that argument, but it's kind of like it goes back to a quip Andy Warhol said years ago when he said, like, if the personal computer was around when he was emerging as an artist, he would have become famous so much quicker, which I think is funny. I get the argument, but in some ways, I'm a bit indifferent to it. It's kind of like, okay, well, labor here has been replaced by something else, which I think is more about circulation. It's no longer about production, it's about circulation. So I can then circulate these images to vast numbers of people, So there's always a trade-off with this stuff. Sure, you don't have the labor element involved, but you've got, potentially a larger audience.
I'd be inclined to disagree with that anyway. I can see how someone would make that argument, but you can make that argument. I'm a photographer.
Sure.
Just take a photo, especially on a digital camera.
Yeah.
Bit of editing on the computer.
Yeah.
There's not much labor there.
Yeah.
But there is the labor of learning, thinking, considering, and that all goes into an AI art piece, doesn't it? Yeah.
Well, I guess the labor for me when I'm generating an AI thing, it's 30 years of labor, 30 years of an artistic kind of sensibility that's informing the selection of those images, And anyone can do that, but in some ways, I kind of like the fact that anyone can do AI. I think that's interesting, But the fact that we need to place value on things because someone spent a lot of time on it, I think is sometimes problematic,
I think it's very problematic. It's because it's quite possible it's actually definitely possible no one could make the same image.
Exactly.
Even with Midjourney.
Exactly.
They could put the same prompt in and they wouldn't get the same image.
I've had the same problem. I was having a show like last year of all AI generated images, and my computer crashed halfway through preparing for the show, and I had to get a computer repaired and stuff, and I basically tried to recreate the same prompts for this body of work using the same platform, and I couldn't do it. It wouldn't actually give me the same kind of result. So, there's something kind of quite idiosyncratic about AI. We don't fully understand it. It always wants to kind of please us, which I find kind of perverse. But yeah, it's kind of like it's a very kind of like interesting media, I think, at the time, where it's kind of like it's really fired up so much debate and so much kind of hatred as well, And ultimately, at the end of the day, don't get me wrong, I think a lot of AI work that's produced on it is just woeful, So that's why we need artists to kind of do more interesting stuff, and to kind of push the medium in another kind of direction, to have another kind of conversation about AI. I don't think there's anything to be gained necessarily by being alarmist about this stuff. It's not going to change it, I prefer to have an interesting conversation about it, rather than kind of running away from it, And I think sometimes the loudest kind of ones complaining about AI are people, like artists anyway, who are working in more conventional media, like painting or sculpture or installation. And there seems to be like a bit of a disconnect there, like I was saying earlier, it's not going to impact on their practice, unless they're producing digital images. So that's all AI is. It's either digital video or digital images. If you're making a 3D object or a painting, go for it. AI is not going to be an issue, So I think there's a bit of a weird kind of disconnect there. I think it is potentially an issue for photographers, or disciplines like illustration, for example. But then again, even for photographers, it's kind of like it's just reconfiguring what photography was, and it's just shifting it. And I don't necessarily see that as a negative thing, Sometimes it's interesting that, things that shift and change or even destroyed, other things come along and replace it, That's how culture moves forward. I think that's kind of interesting.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing with photography, actually, because, again, I'm a photographer. I think it depends on the type of photography you do. I think digital artists are probably the most people directly, in terms of commercially, at threat, in danger of losing their jobs or something.
Yeah.
But photography, it depends on the photography you do. And strictly speaking, in my opinion, I think an image created by AI can't be considered a photograph, because for me, a photograph is made using light on a light sensitive.
Well, there's some kind of lens involved.
There's that sort of exchange of light and light sensitive material. Having said that, AI could cover a lot of the a Coca-Cola ad that would traditionally use a photo. I don't know if AI is there at the moment, but it could get to quite easily to the point where they won't need a photographer. They could just generate that.
Yeah.
So artists like that, they're in that. But if you're doing, say, art photography or something like that, I don't think there's anything to worry about, really.
Well, yeah, it's people just have to kind of calm down a little bit. I know there's the whole kind of AI apocalypse stuff, which is kind of on the cultural radar, that it's all going to kill us all, but that's a whole other kind of conversation. But I think also with AI, there's this kind of, fear that it's somehow kind of removing the soul of the artist, all this kind of stuff. But all of that stuff is so wound up in this kind of incredible romanticism of what we think of the artist anyway, So that's why I don't have such an issue with that stuff, I think one of the big concerns with AI, though, clearly is like the idea of bias and representation, because a lot of AI has been programmed and the algorithms involved in, harvesting these data sets are all from various tech bros and Silicon Valley on the West Coast. So clearly they bring with them their own particular bias. And that's an issue, obviously. But that's why artists who are doing AI need to kind of push back against that stuff and take it somewhere else,
I mean, to me, that makes the software more human.
Yeah, sure.
Because every human has a bias.
Absolutely.
And all that. So it just depends on
Absolutely.
what that bias is. So
yeah,
it kind of humanizes the computer a little bit to me.
Yeah, and I also like it when AI gets it wrong. Like there was a recent case where I think it was Google Gemini. They were trying to overcorrect this issue of bias. So it became very politically correct, and they were, generating these images of like, the founding fathers in America as like, Chinese and kind of like Native American, or they would depict kind of like Nazis as like, Chinese people. So they got a lot of flack for this, but it was like this kind of overcorrection of like, AI bias. So it's interesting when it gets it wrong as well.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you could have a bit of fun with that, couldn't you?
Well, there's certainly some humour there, I think, and perversity, absolutely.
I think, look, there's no problem to me with it. I just kind of, I think I'm getting stuck on this a little bit, like people having a problem with it. I just don't understand it in the sense of, it's like anything. It's like a paintbrush. The paintbrush doesn't paint the painting. The hand paints the painting. Yeah. Without a hand, the paintbrush does nothing. The computer's the same. It's not doing it itself.
Yeah.
It's doing what it's instructed to do.
Sure. I mean, the computer's just a doorstop.
Yeah.
Unless I'm using it, Look, I kind of get the anxiety there. I understand that. But, they said the same thing about, sampling. It was going to replace kind of, drummers and put them out of work. And no doubt that happened. And no doubt, I mean, there's a number of different debates here with AI. So I'm just mindful that my take on it is really within the context of contemporary arts. I know it's kind of, removing people's kind of jobs and stuff like that, but that's not really what I'm focusing on. I'm just focusing on it as a tool for making art. And by the same token, it's also creating new kinds of jobs as well. I heard about something the other day, a prompt curator, like a new kind of like term.
What's a prompt curator?
Someone that generates their own prompts, and you can kind of pay them for like the service. So they'll write kind of prompts for you, So, like with any kind of new technology, there'll be new kinds of ways of defining what it is as it's enmeshed more in cultural narratives, I think, over time.
What do you think the next thing's going to be beyond the AI and all that?
You probably need to talk to Elon Musk. His kind of neural implants direct in the brain, which I find somewhat disturbing, I have to say. I mean, the AI stuff also is that AI has been around for a while. It was developed in the 1960s. It's only on the cultural radar now because we visually see it in these kinds of user-friendly kind of platforms like Midjourney or Stable Diffusion or DALL-E. But AI has probably been around for a long time. It's just increasingly becoming more sophisticated. I mean, there's a lot of fear about, that it needs to be kind of better regulated to avoid it kind of becoming kind of, sentient and kind of, on a path of, annihilation or whatever. But I'm also suspicious of regulating it a little bit as well, because that basically means government regulation. So it's then AI controlled by the government, which I also think is somewhat problematic, I mean, because social media, for example, hasn't been regulated for the last 20 years. It's self-regulated, So I'd like to think AI can still maintain to be kind of self-regulated,
Yeah, and your mention of social media, your art career spans pre-social media, post-social media.
Yeah.
How's that changed your approach and in your view, other people's approach to art and marketing their art?
Sure.
And all that sort of stuff?
Yeah, well, social media, I mean, it's, I have a love-hate relationship with it, like a lot of people. I find it like just kind of insidious in some ways. This kind of like, it gets your kind of, it rewires your brain, I think, which is very disturbing, But I've made projects that kind of reflect kind of social media and kind of comment on social media. And in a way, that's why I use it, because I'm interested in it as raw material for ideas in my art practice. And to be honest, like I didn't have an Instagram account for years. I just wasn't interested. I've only had an Instagram account recently, which is now devoted to all the kind of fucked up AI bodies. So really, I see it as that kind of stuff as like an archive of some of my own work, or, if I even can call it my own work. Like I said earlier, it's just a whole bunch of AI. But I kind of like that. I like the fact that it's kind of my work. It's kind of,
I think it is. I think it's yours.
Well, it's like there's a collaborative process there. I did a project recently. The painter Stephen Rendell is upscaling or using some of my AI imagery on Instagram as starting points for like canvases. So this is interesting kind of, cycle going from like the original work was potentially a photograph. It's gone into an AI data set. I've generated some mutant AI kind of image out of it. Then Stephen has kind of taken that and turned it into like a painting, So I love that kind of hybridity and that kind of mutant media kind of approach there.
Yeah, well, and that's a proper embrace of the, dare I say, the medium.
Sure.
I guess we can consider these programs as mediums now for artists. And
but I think some people even debate that. They just think AI is a glorified collage machine or something. I kind of get that.
So is the human brain.
Exactly. I mean, it's like every time I go to a movie, every time I read a book, every time I watch a TV series or go to an art gallery, I'm absorbing stuff and synthesizing stuff all the time. It's kind of like people have forgotten that that's how artists work, like for generations. And suddenly now it's a problem with AI. Like it's kind of strange to me. It really is.
So is that in your future, you're going to be just keep working with this, or is there an end to it? All these grotesque bodies.
I'm interested in pushing it further. Yeah, I really don't know at the moment. Like it's kind of like I've done so much work over the years working with technologies, and sometimes those technologies then become superseded or die out or obsolete or whatever. So possibly that could happen with AI as well. Who knows? What's also interesting about AI is that it all exists in the cloud. So at any moment, it could just be kind of switched off, So there's something quite strange about that. There's something quite unstable about this imagery, That's why I download everything. So I've got a copy of it,
Well, I think we can wrap it up there.
Okay,
I think
sure.
This has been very educational for me, and you've given me, and hopefully for everyone else. And thank you for actually teaching me that anti-discipline is not an exercise in procrastination.
No worries.
But yeah, I mean, it's pretty wild what you're doing, Ian. I gotta admit, it's really, and I encourage anyone listening, go and check this stuff out, because it's wild.
Something I didn't mention there. I mean, the art world is full of all of these kind of approved themes. Whether it's to do with identity or the environment. And I get that. People are into that stuff. I get it. But I don't need to do that. There's plenty of other people doing that stuff. So I want to take the conversation somewhere else. That's what artists should be doing, and taking the conversation into places that's a bit more kind of difficult or a bit more kind of confronting. You know, I should say too quickly before we finish up.
No, take your time.
A lot of the body horror stuff in my work actually does have a autobiographical kind of connection. You know, because years ago I was in Mexico, and I got chronically sick with a parasite or some kind of microbe. I never really knew what it was, and it completely fucked me over. But it had a profound effect on my art practice. You know, this is like 30 years ago. And so it's one of these perverse things in life where it's kind of like, I'm glad I was infected. Because if I wasn't infected by this parasite, I wouldn't be making the stuff I'm making today.
So when something happens, you don't know if it's fortunate or unfortunate.
Exactly. So it's kind of a weird one there, you know. It actually completely modified my thinking in my art practice and made me very focused on the body more so than ever. So in some ways, my work is about autobiography and it is about identity, but it's kind of perversely about the flayed human body or the fucked up inside out organs of the body. You know, yeah, there you go. There's your identity, you know.
I love that. So the grotesque self-portraits.
That's right.
In a way. Thank you, Ian, for coming along and you know sharing your story and your vision with us.
No worries.
Thank you very much.
Cheers.